Officer Jack Harris sat in his usual spot at the corner of the cafe, a chipped mug of coffee in his hand, eyes fixed on the front door. The world outside seemed to be changing, and he didn't like it one bit. From his corner, he could see the entire cafe, its gleaming counters, the wide windows that let in the bright morning sun, and the employees hustling behind the counter. But Harris didn't notice any of that. His mind was preoccupied with the turmoil brewing within the department. A few weeks earlier, the city had announced a major shift in the police force's leadership. Gone were the old-school ways of handling things. Gone was the tough guy approach that Harris had always admired. The new wave was all about reform, sensitivity, diversity, new policies that promoted inclusion and understanding. Things that Harris found utterly ridiculous. He wasn't just bitter about the changes. He felt threatened. For years, the police department had been his domain, his place to control, to enforce, and to lead. But now it felt like the system was turning against him. He'd heard whispers about the new police chief, someone who wasn't even from around here, someone with no real connection to the streets, who didn't understand the tough decisions that came with policing. It angered him more than he cared to admit. As Harris sipped his coffee, the door swung open, and a woman walked in. She was impeccably dressed, not out of place in a high-end boutique, let alone a local cafe. Dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, business suit with a white blouse. She exuded confidence, the kind of woman who seemed unbothered by the chaos swirling around her. Harris sneered under his breath. She looked like someone who didn't belong here. Probably another person coming in to judge him, to tell him what he was doing wrong. The way she held herself, so put together, so polished, it just grated against everything he believed in. He couldn't help but feel a pang of disdain. She walked to the counter and ordered her coffee, speaking to the barista with a calm, controlled tone. Harris watched her every move, irritated by how effortlessly she seemed to glide through life, while he was stuck in a department that seemed to be getting softer by the day. He hated the idea of change, especially when it felt like it was happening without his permission. He glanced around the room. A few of the regulars nodded at him, but none dared to engage in conversation. They knew him too well. Jack Harris was not the type of cop to take a joke. He didn't believe in soft policing. He believed in being in control, not caving to demands for reform. The city was becoming something he didn't recognize, and he wasn't ready to accept it. The woman at the counter stirred her coffee slowly, her back to him. Harris watched her, feeling a swell of anger. She didn't even look his way, didn't acknowledge the presence of someone like him. Maybe she thought he was invisible, just another tired officer sitting in the corner. She didn't know who he was, didn't understand the weight of his experience, the sacrifice he'd made over the years. Unable to hold back any longer, Harris stood up. He walked over to the counter, his boots clicking against the floor. The woman had just taken a seat at the far end, and he saw his chance. In one swift motion, he grabbed the coffee from the counter and, without a second thought, hurled it toward her. The cup flew through the air, and the steaming hot liquid splashed across her blouse, the coffee soaking into the fabric and scalding her skin. The woman didn't even flinch. She sat still, her face impassive. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The cafe grew silent as every eye turned toward the scene unfolding. Harris was caught up in his own righteous anger, barely noticing the shock on the other customers' faces. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe an insult, maybe an explanation, but the woman simply wiped her blouse with a napkin and calmly looked up at him. Her voice was cool, steady, like she had all the time in the world. "You should probably sit down," she said, her eyes locking with his. "We need to talk." Harris froze. There was something about her gaze, something calm, but unyielding, that made his chest tighten. He thought he knew everything there was to know about power, about control, but this woman was giving him an entirely new feeling, uncertainty. The woman didn't raise her voice, didn't show any signs of anger. She didn't even look fazed by the coffee. All she did was wait for him to respond, her gaze unwavering. Harris's heart pounded in his chest. He stood there, frozen, as the reality of what he had just done slowly began to dawn on him. And then, with a sense of inevitability, she added, "I'm the new police chief." Harris blinked, the words not quite sinking in. The shock was almost too much to process. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, dropped to his sides as the weight of the situation settled over him. He had just thrown hot coffee at the woman in charge of the entire department. Harris stood there, rooted to the spot, the reality of his actions crashing down like a wave. The woman, a calm and collected woman he had just drenched with hot coffee, now stared at him with an unreadable expression. The silence in the cafe seemed deafening, punctuated only by the soft hum of the espresso machine and the distant chatter of customers who were doing their best to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a public spectacle. Her voice broke the silence. "You might want to take a seat. We need to talk." Harris blinked, trying to process what she just said. His first instinct was to make an excuse, to lash out, to try to explain his actions, but nothing came out. His throat felt dry, as if the words were caught somewhere deep inside him. She didn't look angry, didn't raise her voice, but the calm authority in her tone sent a chill through him. She wasn't like anyone he'd encountered before. She wasn't rattled, wasn't flustered by his outburst. There was a quiet power in her demeanor that unnerved him, a power he didn't know how to deal with. The reality of what he'd done hit him in waves, each one more suffocating than the last. "Come on," she said, standing up from her seat with deliberate slowness. She didn't rush, didn't fidget. She was composed in a way that felt almost alien to him. "We're going to the station. Right now." For a moment, Harris hesitated. His mind raced. Was she serious? This couldn't be happening. He had just thrown coffee at a woman, someone who seemed so out of place, so removed from his world. But she had made it clear there was no room for debate. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him as they watched the scene unfold. Some were staring with wide eyes, others whispering in hushed tones. The barista behind the counter glanced nervously between Harris and the woman, unsure of what to do. But no one intervened. No one was going to stop what was about to happen. Harris, despite the knot of dread tightening in his stomach, followed her out of the cafe. The sun outside was bright, but it felt like it had dimmed slightly, as if the world was waiting for him to face the consequences of his actions. The cool air hit his face as he stepped into the parking lot. His car was parked nearby, but he didn't make a move to go to it. Chief Morgan walked ahead of him, her pace unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. Harris had trouble keeping up with her, his thoughts swirling in a fog of confusion. What was he supposed to say to her? What could he say to make this right? He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who dictated the terms. But now, it was as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and he was struggling to catch his footing. They reached her car, a sleek, black sedan that looked out of place in the rundown parking lot. Morgan opened the door and motioned for Harris to get in. He hesitated but climbed into the passenger seat, his body stiff with anxiety. The door closed with a soft thud, and the engine roared to life. The ride to the station was silent. Harris stared out the window, trying to calm the storm inside him. The reality of the situation kept replaying in his mind. He had thrown hot coffee at someone who was now in charge of him, someone who would have every right to end his career with a single phone call. Chief Morgan drove with an effortless grace, her hand steady on the wheel. Harris watched her profile, trying to glean something from her expression, but her face remained calm, unreadable. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't even making small talk to fill the silence. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words were trapped. What could he possibly say that would explain his behavior? He didn't even fully understand it himself. His frustration with the changes in the department had been building for months, but that didn't excuse what he had just done. He had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. The car pulled into the parking lot of the police station, and Harris's stomach turned. He could already imagine the looks he would get from his colleagues. He would be the laughingstock of the department, the officer who had thrown coffee at his new boss. Morgan parked the car and turned off the engine. She didn't say a word as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Harris followed her, the weight of the situation sinking in with each step. When they entered the station, the atmosphere was different. There was an air of quiet authority about Morgan that made the other officers fall silent as they watched her approach. Harris felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, but none of them spoke. The murmurs of gossip that had always filled the station now seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the tension in the air. Morgan didn't acknowledge the others. She led Harris to her office without a word, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The walls of the room were adorned with framed photos of past chiefs, but there was one glaring absence, a picture of the new chief herself. Harris, standing in front of her desk, suddenly felt very small. Morgan sat down in her chair, still looking composed, her eyes fixed on him, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Harris could feel the weight of her gaze. There was no escape now. "You're going to explain yourself, Jack," she said quietly, "and we'll see where we go from here." Harris swallowed hard, bracing himself for what was to come. He had no idea what to say, but he knew he had just crossed a line that would change everything. The door clicked shut behind Harris, and the silence in Chief Morgan's office was almost suffocating. Harris shifted uneasily from foot to foot, unsure of what to do next. The reality of what he had just done, the impulsive act of throwing hot coffee at his new boss, was still sinking in. He had always prided himself on being tough, in control, but now, standing in the presence of this calm and collected woman, his bravado seemed hollow and weak. Chief Morgan didn't immediately speak. She sat behind her desk, eyes steady on him, as if assessing every inch of him. Harris shifted again, his gaze darting around the room. The office was orderly, immaculate even, with a few framed pictures of past police chiefs on the walls. There were no personal touches, no clutter, nothing to make it feel like a space that belonged to a person. Everything about this office, and about her, screamed authority. It was unsettling. Finally, Chief Morgan broke the silence. "You threw coffee at me, Jack," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. There was no anger in her tone, no shouting or finger-pointing. She spoke as though she was stating a fact, not accusing him. "A hot cup of coffee. Do you realize how dangerous that could have been?" Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He wanted to defend himself, to say that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he was frustrated, angry, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense, nothing that would justify his actions. Morgan continued, her gaze never leaving his. "You don't just throw coffee at people, especially not someone in my position. You have no idea who I am, do you?" Harris opened his mouth again, this time a little louder. I didn't know you were the new chief. I thought you were just some outsider, someone who didn't belong in the department." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, his frustration spilling out in a rush. Morgan raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "I see. So you thought it was okay to take out your frustrations on someone you assumed didn't deserve respect." Harris shifted uncomfortably, but now he was caught in his own thoughts. He wasn't sure why he had done it. Maybe it was the months of growing resentment towards the department, the constant changes that were being pushed on the officers. Maybe it was just that sense of powerlessness. He felt like the department was slipping away from him, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. But there was something else, something deeper, that gnawed at him. He had seen people like Morgan come into the department before, young, ambitious officers, eager to make their mark, and he had always pushed them away. But Morgan wasn't like anyone he had met before. "I'm sorry," Harris finally muttered, his voice low. I shouldn't have done that. It was unprofessional. I lost my temper. Morgan didn't immediately respond. She took a moment, studying him closely, as if trying to gauge whether he truly understood the gravity of the situation. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "I'm not here to reprimand you, Jack," she said softly. "I'm not here to tear you down. I'm here to help you understand why what you did was wrong. You think I don't belong in this department because of who I am, but you couldn't be more wrong." Harris blinked, caught off guard by her words. He hadn't expected this. He had expected anger, maybe even threats. But she wasn't angry. She wasn't threatening him. She was calm. Too calm. It was unnerving. Morgan leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped together in front of her. "I wasn't born into this life. I wasn't handed a badge and told to go out and enforce the law. I worked hard to get here. I've faced more than my fair share of challenges, just like you. And I'll tell you this, every decision I make, every action I take as chief, is with the belief that this department can be better, that we can be better." Harris's heart raced. The words she spoke, so simple yet so powerful, caught him off guard. He had always thought of leadership as something he could control, something that came with experience, grit, and a willingness to enforce the rules. But Morgan's words challenged everything he had believed. "You talk about change," Morgan continued, her voice still steady. "But change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. It makes people angry because it forces them to confront their own biases and shortcomings. I'm asking you to think about that, Jack. You have a choice to make. Continue down the path you've been on, or open yourself up to the possibility that we can all grow, including you." Harris stood there in silence, her words hanging in the air. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't filled with contempt. It was, instead, filled with understanding. A kind of understanding he wasn't used to. He had always thought that power came from asserting dominance, from being the one who controlled every situation. But Morgan was showing him that true power came from something deeper. From respect. From humility. "I didn't ask to be chief," Morgan said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I didn't ask for the spotlight, for the pressure. But I accepted it because I believe in this department. I believe in the officers here. I believe we can be better than we've been. But we can't do it if we hold on to old ways of thinking, if we refuse to change." For the first time since he had entered the office, Harris felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Uncertainty, yes, but also something else. A sense of hope, maybe. A sense that, despite everything he had been taught, there might be another way. Morgan's eyes softened. "I'm not asking you to like me, Jack. But I am asking you to respect this department, respect the people who work here, and respect yourself enough to change." Harris swallowed hard, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had always been the one in control, the one who pushed back against change. But now, standing in front of this calm and resolute woman, he felt something shift deep inside him. For the first time in a long time, Harris wasn't sure what would come next. But for the first time, he was willing to find out. The silence in the office stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Harris stood there, his mind racing as he tried to process everything Morgan had just said. It wasn't the scolding he had expected. It wasn't the reprimand he had braced for. Instead, she had given him something unexpected. An olive branch. A chance to change. To be better. And it terrified him. The weight of the coffee incident still hung heavily between them. He had humiliated himself, let his anger take over, and it felt like an insurmountable mistake. But now, Morgan was giving him an opening, an invitation to reconsider the way he saw the department, the way he saw leadership, and, perhaps most painfully, the way he saw himself. Morgan leaned back in her chair, her eyes still fixed on him. She had given him space to process her words, but it was clear she wasn't going to let this moment pass without a resolution. "So," she said finally, breaking the stillness, "what do you want to do now, Jack?" Harris blinked, his chest tight. The question was simple, but it carried a weight he hadn't expected. He could feel the tension building in his body, the fight-or-flight instinct stirring. He could try to walk out of here, put this entire incident behind him, but deep down, he knew that would be the easy way out, and he wasn't sure anymore if he was ready to take the easy way. Not after everything Morgan had said. I don't know," he admitted, his voice unsteady. He wasn't used to this level of vulnerability. It felt foreign to him. "I didn't think I'd be in this position." Morgan nodded, her expression softening but still firm. "Most people don't. Leadership isn't something you can just slip into easily. It takes time. It takes patience. But most of all, it takes honesty. And that's what I'm asking for from you now. Are you willing to be honest with yourself about why you acted the way you did? About what drove you to do something you normally wouldn't?" Harris's jaw clenched as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had never really taken the time to reflect on his actions. At least, not in the way Morgan was asking him to. He had always been focused on just getting the job done, enforcing the rules, maintaining control. But now, standing here, he realized how much of his resistance to change came from a place of fear. Fear of losing power. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of being left behind as the department moved forward into uncharted waters. I guess I was frustrated," Harris said, finally letting the words spill out. "Frustrated with everything changing. The new policies, the new focus on inclusivity and sensitivity. I felt like I was losing control, and I didn't know how to deal with it." Morgan leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "And throwing coffee at me was how you chose to deal with that frustration." Harris winced at the bluntness of her words, but he knew she was right. The coffee wasn't just about the woman in front of him. It wasn't even about her being the new chief. It was about his own fear, his fear of change, of feeling like he didn't belong anymore, of being pushed out of a system he had known for so long. "Yeah," Harris muttered, looking down at his shoes. "It was." Morgan didn't say anything at first. Instead, she sat there, watching him with an expression that was almost too composed. The silence stretched between them, but it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a pause, like a moment of reflection. It felt like an opening, a door waiting to be walked through, if he was willing to take the first step. Finally, Morgan spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "You're not the only one who's afraid, Jack. I'm afraid too. This job, this responsibility, it's a lot to carry. But the difference between you and me is that I'm willing to face that fear. I'm willing to change, to learn, to grow. And I need you to do the same. I can't do this alone." Her words struck something deep inside him. He had never seen a leader like this before. He had always admired the old-school commanders who ruled with an iron fist, who kept their officers in line with force. But Morgan wasn't like that. She led with understanding, with empathy, but also with a quiet strength that made her impossible to ignore. She didn't demand respect. She earned it. "I'm not asking for your loyalty, Jack," Morgan continued. "I'm asking for your commitment to this department, to the men and women who work here, to the people we protect. That's what it's about. It's not about control. It's about service. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Harris swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. He had always believed in the idea of doing what was right, but it was always through the lens of his own rules, his own sense of justice. Now, he was being asked to expand that vision, to see beyond his own narrow understanding of what was just and right. "Okay," Harris said, his voice low but steady. "I get it. I'll do my part. I'll try. I'll be better." Morgan nodded, her lips curling slightly at the corners. "That's all I ask. It's a process. We'll work through it together. But you have to be willing to confront your own biases, your own demons. You have to want it for yourself, Jack." The air in the room seemed to lighten, as if a burden had been lifted, just a little. Harris wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew that for the first time in a long time, He was willing to try. He was willing to face the things that had held him back, to confront the fear and anger that had clouded his judgment. As Morgan stood up, offering him a hand, Harris took it. The grip was firm, but there was a warmth to it. It wasn't just about a new beginning for him. It was about something bigger, something he wasn't sure he fully understood yet. But for the first time, he felt like he might be ready to find out. The days that followed Harris's conversation with Chief Morgan were a blur of new expectations, self-reflection, and a growing sense of discomfort. Harris had always thought he understood what it meant to be a good officer, to enforce the rules, and to lead with authority. But now, with everything that had happened, he realized just how much he had been relying on old habits, habits that didn't fit in with the department's new direction. He found himself questioning everything he had once believed was right. The change was uncomfortable, but Chief Morgan had made it clear. If he wanted to stay in the department, he had to evolve. Harris had thrown the coffee at her out of frustration, but what he hadn't fully realized was that the act had forced him to confront his own insecurities. He had seen Morgan as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, who hadn't earned the right to lead. It was a classic reaction born from fear, and Harris knew now that the fear wasn't just about her. It was about what she represented. She was the embodiment of everything he had feared was happening. The changing face of law enforcement, the shift toward inclusivity and accountability, and the recognition that things couldn't stay the same. He had been reluctant to admit it, but the coffee incident had become a turning point. Chief Morgan had given him a second chance, one that he wasn't sure he deserved. Every day, he found himself waking up with a new resolve, pushing himself to do better, to think before acting, to approach the job with the humility that Morgan had shown him. But the test was just beginning. It wasn't long before his commitment to change was tested in the field. Harris was on patrol with Officer Ramirez, a younger officer who had recently joined the force. Ramirez was a hard-working, eager cop, but he had an air of uncertainty about him. Something that Harris had noticed in the days following their first joint patrol. As they cruised through the streets of the city, Harris felt the familiar tension that always came with his work. The city had always been a volatile mix of calm and chaos, and he knew the streets could turn dangerous in an instant. But today, something felt different. It wasn't the usual tension from a potential threat. It was something else, something less tangible. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it gnawed at him. Ramirez was focused on the road, but Harris could sense that he was also aware of the weight on his shoulders. They passed an intersection where a group of young men were gathered near a corner store. The group was making noise, laughing, and the air around them felt charged. Harris instinctively slowed the car, watching them out of the corner of his eye. Ramirez looked over at him, sensing the tension. "You think we should stop and check them out, sir?" Harris paused. His instincts told him to keep moving, to avoid stirring trouble. But Chief Morgan's voice echoed in his mind. It's not about control. It's about service. He wasn't just an enforcer anymore. He was supposed to protect the community, to build trust. "I think we should keep moving," Harris said after a long beat. "But let's keep an eye on them, just in case." Ramirez nodded, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Harris understood it. The younger officer was still learning how to navigate the balance between enforcing the law and respecting the community. Ramirez was trained to be decisive, to take control of situations when they felt unsafe, and in his mind, this group could turn dangerous. But Harris knew that not every encounter had to escalate. As they continued their patrol, Harris noticed that Ramirez was more quiet than usual. The young officer seemed to be thinking, perhaps processing Harris's decision not to engage with the group. Harris felt a pang of guilt. Had he made the right call? Was he showing the right kind of leadership? The patrol continued without incident, but Harris couldn't shake the feeling that his decision would be scrutinized in ways he hadn't anticipated. The department had changed, and now every choice he made was under a microscope. Every moment was an opportunity to prove he could be a part of that change. Later that evening, as they returned to the station, Ramirez approached him as they were about to part ways. "Sir, I've been thinking about today," Ramirez said, his tone respectful but unsure. "Do you think we should have stopped those guys? They looked like trouble." Harris hesitated. This was a teaching moment. He could easily dismiss Ramirez's concerns, reinforce the idea that their presence alone was enough to keep things in check. But that wasn't the approach Chief Morgan had shown him. The truth was, he didn't have all the answers, and part of leadership was acknowledging that. "No, I don't think we should have stopped them," Harris replied slowly. "I think we need to trust our instincts, but also understand the bigger picture. Not every situation needs to be confronted head-on. Sometimes, letting things pass without escalating is the best way to protect everyone, ourselves, and the community." Ramirez seemed to mull over the words, then nodded slowly. "I get it. It's just hard sometimes, you know, knowing when to push and when to step back." Harris smiled a little, feeling a flicker of pride in the younger officer's willingness to learn. "Yeah, it's hard. But we're here to figure it out together. That's what makes us a team." Later that night, as Harris sat at his desk, he thought about the day. It had been a test, not of his skills as an officer, but of his resolve. The resolve to do the right thing, not because it was easy, or because it followed the old rules, but because it was the best way to serve the community. He was learning to let go of his old habits, to trust in a new kind of leadership. He thought about Chief Morgan's words again. It's about service. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. He wasn't there yet, not completely. But with each passing day, he was getting closer. He was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't about control. It was about trust, understanding, and most importantly, change. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of self-reflection, subtle shifts in behavior, and unspoken tension as Harris adjusted to the new demands of Chief Morgan's leadership. The department had changed since her arrival, and while many of the officers were still resistant to the changes she had initiated, Harris found himself slowly adapting. The old ways of doing things, the harshness, the iron grip of control, seemed to no longer fit. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the department was called out to a disturbance at a local bar. It wasn't unusual for the team to be called to a scene like this. Bars were often places of heated arguments, spilled drinks, and sometimes physical altercations. But this time, the situation felt different. There had been reports of racial slurs being thrown around, and the officers were asked to address the issue without escalating things unnecessarily. Harris wasn't assigned directly to the scene but was called in as backup. He met up with Officer Ramirez and a few other officers outside the bar. The thick, humid air pressed down on them as they stood at the entrance, waiting for orders. Harris could already hear the murmurs of voices inside. Arguments, insults, and laughter mixed with the occasional shout. It sounded like a powder keg waiting to blow, and he could feel the tension starting to build in his chest. He had seen these types of situations escalate before. But now, he wasn't sure what the right approach was anymore. "Okay, everyone, we're not here to make this worse," Sergeant Wells, one of the senior officers, said, leading the group. He was the old-school kind of cop, the kind who believed that a show of force was the quickest way to get people in line. "We're here to get control of the situation and get people out. No need to be soft about this." Harris felt a familiar urge to agree with Wells, to back the old ways that had kept him in control for so long. The use of force was always the quickest solution, wasn't it? But then Morgan's voice echoed in his mind. It's about service. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. He took a deep breath, remembering their conversations. She had shown him a different way of thinking, one that didn't rely on immediate escalation. "We don't need to rush in guns blazing," Harris said, surprising even himself with his words. The others looked at him, confused. "Let's try to talk first. Calm people down before we go in." Sergeant Wells gave him a skeptical look. "You're not in charge here, Harris. Just follow the lead, okay?" Harris bit his tongue, but didn't back down. "I'm just saying it's worth trying." Wells gave a short nod, his eyes narrowing in uncertainty. "All right, we'll give it a shot. But if things get out of hand, we move fast." With a reluctant nod from Wells, the group approached the bar. As they walked inside, Harris could feel the heat of the conflict hanging in the air. The atmosphere was tense. Shouting had begun again as soon as the officers entered. People were glaring at one another across the room, fingers pointing, insults exchanged with slurred words. A few patrons stood, while others remained seated, arms crossed, angry and defensive. "Everybody, calm down." Wells barked, his authoritative tone booming over the room. He was already taking control, trying to force compliance. Harris's heart sank. He could already see that Wells's approach wasn't going to diffuse the situation. It was making people more defensive. The longer he stood there, the more he realized that the command-style leadership wasn't working. He could hear racial slurs, accusations, and threats being tossed around, and the whole place was on edge. The air felt electric, and Harris knew that if things escalated even a little more, they might be facing something bigger than they were prepared for. "Let's just talk to the people involved," Harris said, stepping forward. "We need to understand what's going on here. We don't need to arrest anyone unless we have to." "Are you serious?" Wells growled, his patience clearly thinning. "This isn't a therapy session, Harris." But Harris wasn't backing down this time. He could see that people were more afraid of the officer's approach than they were of the situation. He walked up to a group of men sitting near the back, where the arguing had started. "Hey, let's just take a breath, all right?" Harris said, keeping his voice calm, unthreatening. "What's going on here?" The men looked up, surprised at his soft approach. One of them, a tall, stocky man with a scruffy beard, stood up and pointed at a man across the room. "That guy," he spat, his face contorted in anger, "keeps calling me things. Insults, racial stuff. I'm not taking that." Harris nodded, understanding the frustration. But he also knew that escalating things with anger wouldn't get them anywhere. "Okay," Harris said slowly, his tone steady. "Let's talk it out, all right? You don't need to get physical. We'll help you." The exchange was tense but calm. Harris didn't allow the anger to infect his words or actions. He was focused on finding common ground, de-escalating before the situation could spiral. Slowly, the man seemed to calm down, nodding as Harris spoke with him. Over the next few minutes, Harris managed to convince the men to sit down and stop shouting, letting the situation diffuse without the need for arrests or violence. After a few minutes, Sergeant Wells approached, a look of disbelief on his face. "I'll be damned," he muttered, looking at Harris as the room quieted. "You actually did it." Harris gave a small nod. "Sometimes the hard approach isn't the best one," he said quietly, not wanting to make a show of it. "It's about talking, understanding, not always using force." Wells didn't respond immediately, but Harris could see the gears turning in his head. The rest of the officers, once skeptical, started to see the value in Harris's method, though none of them openly acknowledged it. Later, as Harris walked back to his car, Ramirez came up to him, a thoughtful look on his face. "You were right, sir," Ramirez said, his voice filled with respect. "It's not always about controlling the situation with force. It's about knowing when to hold back and listen." Harris smiled, feeling the weight of the day's events settling in. It was a small victory, but it was a step forward in the kind of leader he wanted to be. There would be more challenges ahead, but today he had learned that true leadership was about more than asserting dominance. It was about understanding, patience, and service. It was a lesson he wouldn't forget. Harris was starting to get used to this new approach, the one that Chief Morgan had introduced. He felt more at ease with himself, more certain in his decisions. The old reactive Harris, the one who relied on force, quick judgments, and control, was slowly fading away. But even though he was making progress, not everyone in the department was on board with the changes. A few officers, especially those who had been on the force for decades, seemed to resent Morgan's vision for the future. They thought her ideas were too soft, too passive. Harris had noticed the disapproving glances in the locker room, the muttered complaints, and the dismissive attitudes toward her leadership. But now, it wasn't just about the department's shift in philosophy. It was about how those who were resisting change would react when pushed too far. The situation came to a head one Tuesday morning during a high-stakes operation. Harris, alongside a team of officers, was tasked with apprehending a suspect involved in a string of violent robberies. The suspect, known for his aggressive behavior and violent tendencies, had been spotted in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was supposed to be a straightforward bust. Everyone was on edge. But Harris had learned to stay calm in moments like these, to think through the options before taking any action. As Harris and his team approached the building, the plan was simple: surround the area, force the suspect into a corner, and apprehend him without putting anyone at risk. They had a plan, and Harris was confident that they could execute it without unnecessary force. But as they moved in, things quickly began to unravel. Sergeant Wells, who had taken the lead on the operation, was already barking orders before the team had even fully surrounded the building. His voice was loud and commanding, but there was a dangerous edge to it, a tone that suggested he was expecting trouble. "Move in. Get him now," Wells shouted, his hand gripping his radio. Harris watched as several officers, clearly feeling the pressure, began to rush forward without hesitation, their focus narrow. Harris felt a familiar pit in his stomach. "Hold up," Harris said, his voice firm but measured. "We've got to keep this contained. Don't rush it." But Wells was already halfway into the building, his boots pounding on the floor as he pushed ahead. The rest of the officers followed, despite Harris's attempt to slow them down. The noise, the rushing, the urgency, it all felt wrong. Harris's gut instinct told him to wait, to take a step back and reassess. But he had no authority over Wells, and he was powerless to stop the momentum that had already built. They reached the second floor of the building. The suspect was cornered in one of the rooms, his back pressed against the wall. He was armed, his fingers tightly wrapped around a gun. Harris could see the wild look in his eyes. The fear, the desperation. It wasn't just a robbery suspect now. It was a man about to make a life-or-death decision. "Put it down," Wells shouted, drawing his weapon. "Now." The room fell into an oppressive silence as the suspect hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. Harris's heart raced. This was the moment that would define the outcome: escalate the situation or defuse it. "Put it down," Wells shouted again, his voice cracking, impatience seeping into every syllable. The suspect raised the gun slightly, and in that instant, Harris reacted. He lunged forward, stepping into the line of fire between Wells and the suspect. His own weapon drawn but not aimed at anyone, Harris put up his hands, his voice commanding but calm. "Stop. Wait." Harris's voice rang through the tense air. "We don't have to do this. Put the gun down, man. We can work this out." Wells looked at him with disbelief, his gun still trained on the suspect. "Harris, get out of the way. He's a threat." The suspect's finger was still on the trigger. Harris could see the fear in his eyes, the desperation. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a man backed into a corner, with nowhere to go but down. Harris knew this moment could end with a fatal shot, but he also knew there was still a chance to de-escalate. "I'm not moving, Wells," Harris said, locking eyes with his sergeant. "We're not killing this guy today. We can take him in without shooting." Wells's jaw tightened. The tension in the room was palpable, but Harris refused to break. He kept his eyes focused on the suspect, his voice steady. "Listen to me," Harris said, taking a step closer. "You don't have to die today. We can get you out of this. Just drop the gun. It's not worth it." The suspect's eyes flicked back and forth between Harris and Wells. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The gun trembled in his hands. The air felt like it was stretching into eternity. And then, finally, the suspect dropped the gun, his hand shaking as he sank to his knees. The tension in the room broke in an instant. Harris didn't move for a moment, allowing himself to breathe again. His body was shaking from the adrenaline, but he kept his composure. Wells, however, was fuming. The surgeon stepped forward, grabbing the suspect roughly by the arm, his grip tight as he handcuffed him. "You're lucky, Harris," Wells muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with disdain. "You don't get to make the decisions here." Harris didn't respond immediately. He simply watched as the suspect was taken into custody. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, but a strange calm settled over him. The outcome hadn't been perfect, but it had been the right one. The man had been given a chance. Later, as the team debriefed back at the station, Wells pulled Harris aside. "You better be ready for the fallout, Harris," he growled. "You just made us look weak." "I did what I thought was right," Harris replied, his voice even but firm. "We didn't have to escalate it. We didn't have to shoot." Wells's eyes narrowed. "Keep thinking that way, and you'll be the one who's out of a job next." Harris stood his ground. He had made his choice, and though he knew it would only make things harder for him in the future, he was willing to live with it. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over. But for the first time, Harris felt like he was on the right path, and he wasn't going to turn back. The weeks following the standoff at the abandoned building were challenging, to say the least. Harris had made his stand, and though the situation had ended without bloodshed, the tension in the department was palpable. Wells had made it clear that he disapproved of Harris's actions, and while Harris had earned some respect from the officers who had been on the scene that day, there were many who still held to the old ways. To them, Harris's reluctance to use force was a sign of weakness, a dangerous sentiment that could undermine the authority of the police force. But Harris no longer cared about fitting into those old molds. He had made his choice, and he was determined to stand by it. Chief Morgan had called him into her office a few days after the operation. The room was quiet, the usual hum of station activity outside the door, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Harris took a seat across from her desk, his posture rigid as always, but his mind clearer than ever. "I've been hearing things," Chief Morgan said, her voice calm but serious, "about the situation with Wells." Harris nodded, already knowing what she was referring to. The rumors had spread fast. His refusal to follow orders, the confrontation in the building, his insistence on de-escalating the situation, none of it had gone unnoticed. "I did what I thought was right," Harris said quietly, his voice steady. "I wasn't willing to let someone die that day if there was a way to avoid it." Chief Morgan studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp. "I know, Harris, and I admire that. I do. But you need to understand, the department isn't just about doing what's right in the moment. It's about the greater picture. There are going to be times when you're going to have to go against the grain, challenge the old ways, and make your case for change. That's what leadership is about." "I know," Harris replied, his voice growing more confident. "But I'm not doing this for approval. I'm doing it because it's what I believe in. People deserve better than what we've been doing." Morgan's gaze softened. "I'm proud of you, Harris. You've come a long way. And I'm not the only one who's noticed." That comment lingered in the air for a moment. Harris's heart swelled with a quiet sense of pride. But he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. He had earned a place in Chief Morgan's eyes, but he also had a long way to go to change the mindset of his colleagues. There was still deep resistance to the idea of a softer, more understanding approach to policing. The following week, Harris was faced with another test of his resolve. The department had been called to respond to a violent protest outside a city council meeting. It was clear from the outset that the situation would be volatile, with the potential for property damage, injuries, and even arrest. As the officers gathered in the parking lot, preparing for what they expected to be an all-out confrontation, Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He knew how easily things could escalate, how quickly violence could erupt if they weren't careful. Once again, Wells took the lead, barking orders and rallying the officers with the familiar tone of authority that demanded compliance. But Harris's resolve remained firm. This wasn't the same kind of confrontation. This wasn't about putting people down or controlling them through force. This was about making a choice, choosing to stand between the crowd and the police, to be a bridge, not a barrier. "We need to let them voice their anger," Harris said, walking alongside Wells as the officers prepared their gear. "Rushing in with batons won't fix this." Wells shot him a cold look. "You think talking to them will solve everything, Harris?" "It's not about solving everything," Harris replied calmly. "It's about listening. And if we don't listen, we're just going to make it worse." Wells didn't respond, but there was an unspoken challenge in his silence. As they approached the protesters, Harris felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. It wasn't just about the protest. It was about proving to his department, to the city, and most importantly, to himself, that there was a better way to approach these tense situations. The protest was loud, a cacophony of chants and signs. Anger was in the air, but it wasn't aimed at the officers just yet. Harris stepped forward, his hands visible, his body open and non-threatening. He could see the fear and frustration in the eyes of the protesters, but he also saw something else: hope. They were looking for a reason to calm down, a way to be heard without violence. "Hey," Harris called out to the group. His voice was firm but gentle. "We hear you. We understand you're upset, but we don't need to do this with force. Let's talk. We can do this without anyone getting hurt." For a long moment, the protesters hesitated, looking at Harris with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He stood his ground, maintaining eye contact with those closest to him. It was an act of trust, of vulnerability, that he hoped would allow them to feel safe, to trust that the officers weren't their enemies. Slowly, the crowd began to quiet. A few people, emboldened by Harris's presence, stepped forward to speak, and one by one, the tense atmosphere began to ease. The protesters, realizing that the officers weren't here to fight, began to engage with them, voicing their concerns, but without the violence that so often accompany these kinds of events. Wells stood behind him, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But Harris knew that this was another moment of change, another step in the right direction. When the protest finally dispersed without incident, it wasn't just because they had done their job. It was because Harris had chosen to be something more than just an enforcer. He had chosen to be a leader, a listener, someone who was willing to make a real difference. As the sun set on that evening, Harris knew that his journey wasn't over. The challenges would keep coming, and there would be more tests, more resistance, more moments when he would have to choose between the old ways and the new. But for the first time in his career, Harris felt that he was walking the path of true change. One step at a time, one decision at a time. And no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, Harris was ready to face it, knowing that he was leading with his heart as much as with his badge.